Hey, Jane, you want to go to lunch with us other folks today? Okay, we're going to Napoli. Napoli is what we go.
Good morning.
You joined the cooking club?
Huh?
The cooking club?
Yeah.
Just kind of thumbing it. Other than that, doing good.
I understand how that is.
Good morning. How are you?
Good to see you.
Yes, good morning.
All right, I'm going to get us started here this morning. Psalm 45. Psalm 45. My heart overflows with a goodly theme. I address my verses to the King. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You are the most handsome of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your glory and majesty. In your majesty ride on victoriously. For the cause of truth and to defend the right, let your right hand teach you dread deeds. Your arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies. The peoples fall under you. Your throne, O God, endures forever and ever. Your royal scepter is a scepter of equity. You love righteousness and hate wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. From ivory palaces, stringed instruments make you glad. Daughters of kings are among your ladies of honor. At your right hand stands the queen in gold of Ophir. Hear, O daughters, consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty. Since he is your Lord, bow to him. The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, the richest of the people with all kinds of wealth. The princess is decked in her chamber with gold woven robes. In many colored robes she is led to the king. Behind her the virgins, her companions, follow. With joy and gladness they are led along as they enter the palace of the king. In the place of ancestors, you, O king, shall have sons. You will make them princes in all the earth. I will cause your name to be celebrated in all generations. Therefore the peoples will praise you ever and ever. Lord, we pray for your Spirit to be present with us this morning as we study and consider your word together. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right, if y'all want to open up with me to the ending of the Gospel of Mark chapter 16. So it's been what seems like forever since we've had Bible class. But we are technically continuing what we were talking about the last time we did have class, which I guess was 3 weeks ago. If you remember, we've been talking about how we got the Bible. And the last several classes that we had, we've been talking about the transmission of the text. So these authors wrote their books or wrote their letters, and we don't have any copies of the original, but what we do have is copies of copies of copies of copies. And we've talked about, in essence, the science of comparing those copies and figuring out what did the original most likely say. And so we've talked about how you date, not all the evidence is created equal. So you want to date the manuscripts. The older manuscripts are going to be a little bit more important than the later manuscripts. Manuscripts from certain places in the world where we know that scribes were very diligent in their copying are more important than manuscripts from other places in the world. So we talked about manuscripts originating in Alexandria, so in the Egyptian part of the world, are held up as much more likely to be accurate than manuscripts that are found in other places in the world. We also talked about how you have to look at certain things inside of a text. So we use the Gospel of Luke as an example, and we're trying to figure out, was this verse original or was it not? One of the things you have to ask is, how likely would it have been for Luke to write this? And so the example that I gave is the sweat drops of blood that are a part of Luke's passion narrative, and how those words are disputed and likely not original because they don't fit Luke. Luke presents Jesus as very stoic at the end of his life, very much in control. He dials back the agony of Jesus that we see in his source in the Gospel of Mark. Luke dials it back, whereas you might say Mark emphasizes a little bit more of the humanity of Jesus at the end of his life. You could say that Luke emphasizes a little bit more of the divinity, the godness of Jesus at the end of his life. So it doesn't fit with Luke. When everywhere else Luke tones it back, it doesn't make sense to have this one verse where Luke dials it up. That's just not what Luke does. It doesn't fit in Luke. It would fit if we had it in Mark. It would fit if we had it in Matthew. It doesn't fit in the Gospel of Luke. And so you have all these things that you have to consider when you're comparing all of the manuscripts together. And so what I want us to start doing this morning is not only put some of those things that we talked about into practice, but also talk about some of the missing verses in our modern translations and why they are missing, or why sometimes they're included, but they're included in a footnote. They're not included in the actual text, or in the actual text. The ending of the Gospel of Mark is an example. You'll have some kind of note that says something like earliest and best manuscripts do not include these verses. So I want to talk about why those things are the case. And to do that, though, we need to take a step back to the last thing we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So I'm actually going to go back a slide. Erasmus's Textus Receptus. So Erasmus was the first guy to say, why don't we try to put together a Greek text of the New Testament? It was originally written in Greek. It had been translated. By this point in time, the language of the world is no longer Greek, it's now Latin. And the texts of the Old Testament had been translated into Latin. They become what's called the Latin Vulgate. And that was the Bible during the time of Erasmus, when Latin. And now, Erasmus is like, well, we have these translations of the New Testament in Latin, but he was like, wouldn't it be a good idea to try to put together a Greek original? Like, what did the Greek original likely say? And Erasmus was the first one to think that this is a good idea. So Erasmus brings together all the Greek manuscripts that he has to try to do this. The problem is, at this point in time, Erasmus didn't have very many manuscripts. The majority of the manuscripts that we have today, so we have thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament. I want to say we have about 5,000 Greek copies of the New Testament that aren't found in like lectionaries or something else, just copies. Now, they're not all complete copies, but we have about 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Erasmus had 10. That's all he had available to him. We hadn't discovered the majority that we have today. And so what Erasmus does is very much ahead of his time. And Erasmus does a great job for what he has available to him. The problem is he doesn't have very much available to him. And so what we get is the first Greek manuscript of the New Testament that's come about by the compiling of evidence. But it's a very inaccurate representation of what the original Greek manuscript most likely said. So, for example, you see of the Gospels, Erasmus has 2 manuscripts. The book of Acts, he has 3. Of all of Paul's letters, he has 4. Now, you have to think we have more than 4 manuscripts of every single one of Paul's letters now, not just 4 in the entirety of all of Paul's letters. For the book of Revelation, he had one manuscript, but it was incomplete. He did not have the full book of Revelation in Greek. So a lot of what he has to do sometimes is to take the Latin version and translate it back into Greek. And that gives us Erasmus's Greek text. You'll also notice they all date from the 11th to the 15th century. We now have manuscripts that date as early as the 2nd century. So his manuscripts were not only few, but they were very late compared to the evidence that we have now. Today, if you're trying to figure out what the original Gospel of Mark said, you might not even look at a 15th century manuscript because we have so much better evidence from so early on. That 15th century manuscript is probably not going to be very helpful for you in 2024. It was all Erasmus had back when he was putting this together around the 17th century.
So where did Aramaic writers come in?
So
Before or after this?
it was before this. So Aramaic was the common language for Jews in the time of Jesus. So we get some Aramaic phrases in the New Testament because it was likely the language Jesus spoke and taught in. It would have been the language that his Jewish contemporaries spoke. And so Aramaic would come before this, but we get some words and phrases in the New Testament that are in Aramaic, though 99% of it's in Greek. We get a few phrases here and there. Okay, so I say all that to say Erasmus is ahead of his time. He creates this Greek version of the New Testament, though it's very inaccurate just because of his lack of resources. That Greek text becomes the text that is used to create the first English version of the Bible. So the original 1611 King James, I think I mentioned this in our last class, is translated from Erasmus's Greek text, which is why we have a lot of what are called modern translations today. So ESV, NIV, New American Standard, New Revised Standard, all of these that are common in circulation. And the reason we call them modern translations is because they're built on much more accurate Greek texts that are used to translate into English. Whereas King James and New King James, even if it was one that was printed yesterday, is still based on Erasmus's Greek text. It has the Greek base has never been changed. So there are quite a few inaccuracies in King James, New King James. Not that they're major, not that you can't go to heaven by reading one, but just accuracy percentage. It's not as accurate as a more modern translation that's based on a better Greek text base. Anyway, I say all that to say it was King James version where we get verses added. Right? So the verses you have in your Bible are based on the King James English version, which is based on Erasmus's Greek version. And what that means is the verses are put in based on Erasmus and King James. And then we discover a bunch more manuscripts. And now we can recreate a much more accurate Greek text. And when we do, we're like, oops, Erasmus included some things in his Greek text that we now know, because we have more evidence, were not original. Now the problem with that is they've already been given verse numbers. And you can't go and change all the verse numbers because that gives a problem. Think about if somebody went through and created a version tomorrow and they changed the verse numbers. That's a problem when I get up and say, turn to Mark 13 verse 3 because mine may be different than yours, right? The Bible is so widespread you can't change the verse numbers. It's too late in the game to go back and put new verse numbers in. But now that we have so much more evidence, we've realized Erasmus made some mistakes. It's not Erasmus's fault. He didn't have the evidence that we now have, but he made some mistakes, which means there's some mistakes in the verses in our English Bibles. Now what do we do? And that is why verses get taken out. I don't know, I see people talk about this on social media a lot of the times, and they always it's always some kind of what I would call like conspiracy theory. It's like they take verses out because they don't want you to know that these verses exist, or that's not the case. It's now based on some really good evidence where like they weren't original because of this line of history. And so what do? You generally what they do is they don't completely take them out so they're not there. And the reason is that if you have an NIV and somebody else, and you're talking to someone with a King James, you both still have the same verses. The newer translation generally just puts them in a footnote. And so they're there, but they take them out of the main body of the text, and they put them in a footnote with some kind of note that says the earliest and best manuscripts do not include, because now we have the earliest and best manuscripts, which were not available to Erasmus. So that's the history of why verses are taken out. It's nothing evil that somebody's trying to do. It's that we have really good reason to. And when we give some examples, I think you'll see why there's really good reasons to do this, and it'll also give us a little bit more an insight into what scholars who are much smarter and probably much nerdier than all of us spend all of their days doing, is figuring all this stuff out for us, so you and I don't have to do it. Though I find it kind of fun, so maybe I'm one of the nerdy ones, but anyway, does anybody have any questions on that? That's a lot of history. That's not all that. It's important just to kind of get the context of why they're, but the individual details probably aren't. Just as long as everything kind of.
What is
Receptus translate to?
The received text.
Received, okay.
So it's,
I was trying to put
yeah.
that together. Okay.
Textus Receptus is the received text. So it becomes the Greek text that is received by pretty much all of Christianity for a very long period of time. So Erasmus's received text was the Greek text for the majority of Christian history. Like when compared to the Greek text that we have now, has not been the accepted text for as long as Erasmus's was. So that's why it gets the name received text. And that's also connected with the idea that it was used for the King James, which was the English Bible for the majority of Christianity in its English period, right? The King James was prominent for a lot longer than any of our modern translations have been up to this point. And it's still a very popular translation. I think it's still, I want to say last year it might have fallen out of the top 5 most purchased translations, but it's still in the top 10 and probably will be for all time, I feel like. But it's started to fall, but it's still a highly used text.
Talk about
Today.
taking verses out of the Bible. Guy was up preaching, and he quoted a scripture or something, and he says it's in my Bible and it's in your Bible. The lady sitting up close to the front said, "It's not in my Bible." He said, "Well, let me see." She said, "I can tell you, it's not in there." He said, "I tore it out."
Oh, that's funny. That reminds me of another point connected to that, of why I think these discussions of the missing verses are important, at least from my perspective, is there's no verse that's debated that completely changes our theology. So, for example, Mark 16:16 is a Church of Christ favorite. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. Not originally in the Gospel of Mark. But you don't need Mark 16:16 to teach baptism, right? Nor do I think it's actually the best place to go. I would go to Romans chapter 6, personally. I think that's the best place. Best sustained argument for what baptism does is Paul's argument there in Romans chapter 6. I say all that to say, if we're going to make an argument or take a stand on a belief, my encouragement is always do it with verses that aren't disputed. You don't need the disputed verses, but what that does is now you have to argue for why you think Mark 16:16 is original, and then you can go from there to make some argument about baptism. Or you can go to Romans 6, that nobody has ever disputed is not original, nobody's ever disputed is not written by Paul, and say, see, Paul, like you take out a whole swath of argument against what we're talking about. That's just, I don't know. That's a pet. It's always been a pet peeve of mine, because I've seen people make some very weird arguments sometimes, and they stand on some disputed verses, and I'm always sitting there like, I could ruin your argument in 1 second by showing you the manuscript evidence, and then you're kind of left with, well, I don't know what to do from here. Anyway, the ending of the Gospel of Mark. So if you turn to Mark 16, you'll notice that after verse 8, you're going to have, especially if you're using a modern translation, so anything other than King James, New King James, your version probably says something, and probably has verse 9 through verse 20 in some kind of brackets or something like that. Am I correct? Are most of y'all seeing that?
Yeah.
I have up above verse 9, it says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20.
Yes, okay. So most of y'all should have something like what hers reads. You probably also have a footnote that has a bunch of junk in it, I would imagine. So the way that my version looks is, so let me back up. There's a shorter reading of Mark and there's a longer reading of Mark. And your version probably says something like that. So mine, in the main text, after verse 8, I have a title, The Shorter Reading of Mark, and has a section in brackets. And then mine says under that, The Longer Reading of Mark. And then there's brackets and the traditional verses 9 through 20. Your translation might just have the longer reading, but if you read through your footnote probably mentions a shorter reading. Am I correct in saying that? And what that means is that the manuscripts of Mark that we have, there's 3 different ways that Mark ends. Sometimes it ends at verse 8, and there's nothing after that. Sometimes you have the traditional verses 9 through 20, which is referred to the longer ending. You have this long section of verses, and that's how Mark ends in some manuscripts. In other manuscripts, you have a shorter ending of Mark, and that's where the shorter one is referenced. So in all the manuscripts, you have 3 options for how the Gospel of Mark might have originally ended. At verse 8, shorter reading, longer reading. And your versions reflect that in some form or other, whether in the main text or in your footnote. You have the idea that you have these 3 possible endings, and not all manuscripts agree on how Mark ends. We're going to pretend for our discussion this morning like the shorter reading doesn't exist, because there's not very good evidence at all for the shorter reading. The evidence is pretty split on the longer reading. So did Mark include verses 9 through 20, or did Mark end at verse 8? Those are the 2 that have the most evidence. So I want us to walk through now what the evidence is for an ending at verse 8 versus what the evidence is for the longer reading, for the inclusion of verses 9 through 20. I am firmly convinced that verses 9 through 20 were not original to the Gospel of Mark. That's pretty much universally held by scholars today, which is why it's in brackets in your version, and you have some kind of note that other manuscripts and early witnesses don't include, or something to that effect. So, if you remember when we talked about, you start with what we call external evidence, so that's comparing manuscripts. Where were the manuscripts written? What time period were they written? So on and so forth. So, an original ending at verse 8 is witnessed in the 2 oldest and best Unschul manuscripts. If you remember Unschul, they were the manuscripts that were written in all capital letters with no spaces. If you were here, I showed you a picture of what that looks like. Let me see if I can put that. Yeah, here we go. That. The all capitals, no spaces,
Is
that
Greek?
eventually,
Is that Greek?
yes.
Okay.
So this is one of the codex I mentioned, Codex Sinaiticus. So codex was an early book. Christians were the first people to kind of do a book form like this and get away from the scrolls. And the earliest ones are still in this style. All capital letters, justified is what you would call it if you were using like Microsoft Word or something like that. You can see that they try to make the ends of the lines on both sides neat. No spaces, again in the letters, all capitals. And we talked about how the transmission of text, so the earliest texts and the original documents would have been written in this style. All capitals, no spaces. And then Greek moves to what's called a minuscule style, which is this. So it's a cursive style, uppercase and lowercase letters now, and you get spaces in between words, though it might be difficult to see the spaces within the words because you don't know Greek, but I promise you there are spaces between the words. And you get this cursive style. And I mentioned that's one way that manuscripts are dated. So you know if it's in all capitals, it's an earlier manuscript. If it's in lowercase, it's a later manuscript because we know how the Greek language moved. You can also tell by what kind of paper it's written on. So papyrus was what was written on early. Papyrus moves into parchment. And so if it's written on parchment, it's later than something that's written on papyrus because we know how not only the way that Greek was written changed, but what Greek was written on changes. Okay. All right, so the two oldest and best Unschul manuscripts, ones with these capital letters, Sinaiticus, which was written in the 4th century, and Vaticanus, which was also written in the 4th century. So we have two very good pieces of evidence that date early, so the 4th century, for an ending at verse 8 that the gospel Mark didn't include, verses 9 through 20. They're also both Alexandrian. Remember what I said, that Alexandrian is the place that you want them from because they're most accurate. So there's a lot of good evidence for an ending at verse 8. The longer reading, so the inclusion of verses 9 through 20, is found in manuscripts that date all the way back to the Diatessaron, which means through the Gospels. It's the first harmony of the Gospels that was ever written, which was written in the late 2nd century, so 170. It's also in some evidence from the 3rd century, the 4th century, and the 5th century. Now, I mentioned it should be noted that several manuscripts that include the longer ending have an asterisk or an obli noting that it is not original. So, sometimes what happens when manuscripts are copied and something gets added to it, normally for explanation. So it's like, this is hard to read, I'm going to add a little explanation so that the audience knows what's going on. They'll mark it. So they'll put like an asterisk next to it or something like that to let the reader know, I added it. Like, this isn't original, this is added, this is an explanation.
When we put parentheses.
Yes. Yeah, so you might, you think today you might put something in parentheses or brackets because you're adding to it. So that prime example of that is if you've ever been reading a book and somebody's quoting from something and they want to add their own words into it, right? You bracket that off. Or you're quoting someone and you want to emphasize something, so you put something in italics or bold, and they'll add afterwards emphasis added, right? So you know that the original author didn't bold or italicize this, the guy who's quoting it did. So yeah, same type of thing. And so a lot of the places where it shows up, the author is noting that this was added, which is a very interesting thing. In some places it's put in there as if it were original. In other places it's put in there with a note that somebody added this. Like we have evidence that this was not there and it was added in. Verse 8 through verse 9 through 20, the longer reading, shows up all over the place. It shows up in Alexandria, it shows up in Western text, it shows up in Byzantine texts. So, what that means, when you take all that, it seems to me that the manuscript evidence is divided almost equally. Right? Because ending at verse 8, 2 4th century manuscripts that we know are very, very, very reliable. Like they're like number 1 and number 2 of what you find in these generally you can assume is original. However, the longer reading, verses 9 through 20, is found in some not as important manuscripts, but still ones that date very early. So we know that verses 9 through 20 go back very early, at least to the end of the 2nd century, when if they were added, they would have been added. The longer reading also shows up in multiple places throughout the world, which is theoretically what you want. You want it to show up here, and you want it to show up over here, and you want it to show up over there, which the longer reading does. Verse 8 doesn't show up in as many places, but if verses 9 through 20 were added early, then you wouldn't expect verse 8 to show up in a lot of places, if that makes sense. Because the longer you have a version, the more it gets copied and the more it gets sent around the world. If it's changed early on, it's not copied as often. And so it doesn't have the opportunity or the length to be able to spread throughout the world. It's also interesting that a lot of the manuscripts that add verses 9 through 20 note that the author knows that they're not, or believes that they're not original. Like they have some kind of evidence that says, or maybe they know the guy who added it, or maybe they were the ones that added verses 9 through 20 to it. So you have some early scribes that note in their copies that they don't believe that it's original.
The question, so people that were writing these very early manuscripts, like Mark, it was him. He was there in the day, and he knew Jesus. He knew of him. He came after Jesus.
Mark didn't know Jesus. The Gospel of Mark is attributed to John Mark, who was a sometimes companion of Paul.
Okay, so he came later.
And also might have known Peter. So if John Mark wrote it, then he knew people who knew Jesus, but didn't know him himself, likely.
So when the 9 through 20 verses were added at some point, was that just verbal, like stories that got passed down that they were telling? They had been telling these stories, but no one had ever written it down, and then someone at some point said, "Oh, we need to put these in here."
I'll get to that.
Okay.
I've got an answer. Because I believe I'm pretty convinced on what happened when you look at the evidence. So give me 1 minute to get there. So when you look at the manuscript evidence, it's pretty balanced. And what happens when it's balanced is then you have to go into the text and you ask the question, which one was most likely for Mark to have done? Is it more likely for Mark to have ended at verse 8, or is it more likely for Mark to have ended at verse 20? And that's where you get into the internal evidence. where verses 9 through 20 absolutely fall apart. So, let's go to our Bibles. We've got just a couple of minutes here, and I want to show you what's going on. Let's begin reading Mark 16 and verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. So they entered the tomb. They saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell the disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. All right, so Mark 16 opens up with these three women, right? Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. They go to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body with spices. They find the stone rolled away. This man appears. If we compare this to Matthew and Luke, probably referring to an angel, and says Jesus has risen. Go and tell the disciples what has happened. But the women don't, right? At least at verse 8. They're scared and afraid, and they don't go say anything to anyone. That's verse 8. Now we move into verse 9, and there's some interesting things. So let's keep reading, and I want you to notice the flow. Now after he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. In verse 1 through 8, the subjects are the three women, Mary, and Salome, right? They're the subjects. Jesus is not a subject. He's not a character in the first 8 verses, right? They find the tomb empty. They don't talk to Jesus. They don't see Jesus. They don't know what's happened to Jesus in the first 8 verses. You get to verse 9, the subject changes. Right? We change from the three women being the subject to Jesus being the subject. But, and not all English versions reflect this, but in the Greek, Jesus isn't named. It's the pronoun he. He rose, he appeared, he spoke. If you know at least anything about English or any language in the way that grammar works, you don't introduce a subject with a pronoun, right? Because it leaves the reader wondering, who is he? I don't know who he is because there hasn't been a he. The only he is the angel. So if you take the pronoun back to the last male subject, you get the angel as the one who rose, not Jesus. Jesus, you would introduce Jesus, right? When you switch subjects from the women to Jesus, you say, when Jesus rose. Then you can say, he appeared, referring back to Jesus, and he said. There is a major continuity problem with the flow, because you have this subject change that's introduced by a pronoun instead of introducing Jesus. The other problem, in verses 1 through 8, there's 3 women, Mary, and Salome. As the narrative continues, we're left to wonder, well, what happened to the other 2 women? Mary and Salome are never mentioned. Like, they just disappear from the story. They were main characters in the first 8 verses, and all of a sudden at verse 9, poof, they just disappear from the story as if they were never there. The other interesting thing is Mary Magdalene was one of these women that was a main subject in verses 1 through 8. She's an important person throughout the Gospel of Mark. Like, we know who Mary Magdalene is. She pops up multiple times throughout Mark. You'll notice in verse 9, when it says that he, whoever he might be, appears to Mary, it says that he appeared to Mary Magdalene, the woman from whom he cast out 7 demons. As if we don't know who Mary Magdalene is. See what I'm saying? Why is she we know she's already been introduced earlier in Mark, and she keeps on appearing. And now she appears again, but it's almost like the author assumes that we don't know. Well, this is the Mary Magdalene that I'm talking about. And it leaves the reader, well, like, no duh, she was like a verse before. Like, I knew who she was. And she was here, she was here, and she was here, and she was here. And then she gets reintroduced. My point is, just the transition from verse 8 to verse 9 is very rough. Which, if you read through the rest of the Gospel of Mark, is not common. Mark doesn't have these rough transitions. The other thing that I want to mention real quick, we're almost out of time, but this is interesting. In verses 9 through verse 20, so we've got 11 verses here, right? In verses 9 through verse 20, in 11 verses, we have 15 words that show up nowhere else in the Gospel of Mark. That is more than one word per verse that Mark has not used in 16 chapters that show up in the last 11 verses. We have one word that's not used anywhere else in the New Testament, which is called a hapaxgomenon. Not that you have to remember that, it's not going to be on a test or anything, I just like the word. So we have one word that's not used anywhere else in the New Testament, one phrase not used anywhere else in the New Testament, one phrase that is never used to refer to the disciples anywhere in the New Testament, two words and two phrases that are not used to refer to the disciples anywhere else in Mark's Gospel, one word not used to refer to the resurrection appearances anywhere else in the New Testament, and four words that are not used to refer to Jesus anywhere else in the New Testament. And I say that to say, authors don't change their language in the last 11 verses of a 16-chapter book. That's just not what they do. You use the same language that you've been using for the first 16 chapters. And not only is the transition from verse 8 to verse 9 very rough, but the vocabulary shifts. It's very, very different. If you read, and again, this doesn't show up in English. If you were reading it in Greek, you would see, man, in other words, you get to verse 9 and you're like, someone else had to have written. This is not Mark. Like, I know Mark. I've been reading Mark. This isn't Mark. The language completely shifts. And when you take that all into consideration, there's a couple of other things next week that I'll mention regarding consideration. When you take that evidence, the rough shift between verses 8 and verse 9, and then the drastic change in vocabulary, it becomes very unlikely that Mark actually wrote this. So how did it get in there? We'll talk about this more next week, but I won't leave you hanging. So what likely happened is a scribe reading this did not like a gospel that ended at verse 8 because it's terrible. Or at least they thought it was terrible. I think it's genius, but I'll explain that next week. So at verse 8, you get a gospel ending with, the women were scared and afraid. That's the end of the story of Jesus. They were scared and afraid. They didn't tell anyone. A scribe was reading that and thinks, like a lot of people even today think, that's not a very good ending. Mark, why are we just ending with, where is Jesus? Like, Mark never actually tells us what happens to Jesus. Was Jesus resurrected? Was he not? Where is his body? The women are scared and afraid. They're told to go to tell, but they're scared. So do they tell? Does anybody find out? What happens next in the story where Mark, ending at verse 8, kind of ends on a cliffhanger? And so what likely happened is a scribe reading that is not satisfied with an ending of a gospel at verse 8, ending on a cliffhanger. So what did they do? What's interesting is everything found in verses 9 through 20 can be found at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, at the end of the Gospel of Luke, and at the beginning of the book of Acts. So it seems what happens is a scribe says, I don't like this ending, but the scribe's like, but I know how the story ends. I have Matthew, I have Luke, I have Acts. And so they take the ending of those three books, they compile it together, and you get verses 9 through 20. That's added to be like, hey, this is how the story ends. I don't like how Mark ended it, but I know how it ends. And this is how it ends. Which goes back to my point of, if you want to argue something that's found in Mark 16, 9 through 20, it's also found at the end of Matthew, it's also found at the end of Luke, or it's found at the beginning of Acts. Like, you can go somewhere. Everything found there is found in other Gospels. So what seems most likely is that a scribe took the endings of Matthew, Luke, and beginning of Acts and just compiled them together and made a mashup and stuck it at the end of the Gospel of Mark, which is why you get the language and vocabulary change. Because the scribe is borrowing from two different authors and probably inserting some of his own language. So you get three different authors that put together verses 9 through 20. And so you get a very hodgepodge of language that doesn't show up anywhere else in the New Testament sometime. I'm over time by almost 5 minutes, but I know that's not a surprise to any of you. We will pick up there and finish talking about Mark, and then I have two shorter examples to give, and then maybe a longer example.
And just real quick, in verse, in Mark, it does, the angel does say, you're looking for Jesus, he's not here, he's risen.
Yes, which,
He was crucified, he is risen, and he's not here. So
And it-
it's kind of like, he did tell them what happened to them.
and well, yeah, and you're, so if you don't have Mark, you're kind of left with also asking, well, is that what happened? Because no one's seen Jesus. This man just says he was resurrected, and that's why the addition includes an appearance, right? Jesus appears to Mary, and so you get some solid grounding. Oh, Jesus did raise because Mary actually saw her. Yes, yeah, Matthew and Luke and all the other Gospels talk about him having other appearances.